I evicted my entire family after they spent my inheritance on a wedding. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. My sister screamed that I was ruining her dream wedding. I just smiled and handed her an eviction notice. Red and blue police lights pulsed through the massive bay windows of my grandfather's estate, casting jagged shadows across the Italian marble floors. Chloe stood there in a $12,000 silk bridal gown, her face twisted in an ugly, primal rage that ruined her perfect makeup. My mother, Helen, was hyperventilating on the velvet sofa, clutching her chest in a desperate, theatrical attempt to draw sympathy from the two stone-faced deputies standing in the foyer. My father, Tom, just stared at the floor, sweating through his custom-tailored tuxedo. They looked like cornered animals, finally caught in the steel trap of their own entitlement. It wasn't supposed to end this way, but they had left me absolutely no choice. To understand this visceral wreckage, you have to understand what this house actually meant. It wasn't just real estate, it was the anchor of my life. My grandfather was a hard, practical man who built a lucrative construction company from the dirt up. When he passed away 3 years ago, he left everything to me. I'm Mark, 29 years old, a guy who works 40 hours a week managing logistics. Grandpa bypassed his own daughter, my mother, completely. He knew Helen and Tom were financial parasites, constantly drowning in credit card debt and desperate to maintain the illusion of high society wealth. He left me his fully paid off, 4,000-square-foot suburban home and a substantial trust account meant to secure my future. I was supposed to be the responsible one, the custodian of his legacy. But I made a fatal miscalculation. I thought generosity could cure their toxicity. 6 months after the funeral, my parents lost their heavily mortgaged condo. They came to me begging, tears streaming down Helen's face, swearing they just needed a few months to get back on their feet. I let them move in, rent-free, bringing Chloe along. I handed over the keys to the kingdom out of blind family loyalty, ignoring the cold mechanical reality of their past behavior. I invited the wolves into the safest place I had ever known, and they immediately began to feast. I never suspected they were already plotting to rip my entire future to shreds. The day they moved their battered leather suitcases into the guest wing, the atmosphere of the house shifted entirely. The heavy oak doors and quiet corridors of my grandfather's sanctuary were suddenly replaced by a chaotic, grinding machinery of entitlement. Helen immediately began rearranging the furniture, hiding my grandfather's antique clocks and replacing them with cheap, flashy modern art she bought on clearance but pretended was designer. Tom took over the garage, treating my workspace like a storage unit for his endless failed business ventures. And Chloe, my 25-year-old sister, claimed the master bedroom without even asking. She just moved her massive vanity in while I was at work, leaving my things piled in a smaller bedroom down the hall. It just makes more sense, Mark. My mother had purred, blocking the doorway when I confronted them. Chloe needs the space for her clothes, and you're a single guy. You don't need all that square footage. Besides, we're a family. We share. I swallowed the resentment, telling myself it was temporary. I was working long hours, exhausted, and didn't have the energy to fight a 3-on-1 war in my own home. I paid the property taxes, the utilities, and the grocery bills. They paid nothing. Months turned into a year, and the few months to get back on their feet became a permanent, comfortable stagnation. Tom stopped looking for a job entirely, spending his days drinking scotch on the patio. Helen joined a local country club using a trial membership, networking with wealthy housewives and pretending she owned the estate. But the real nightmare began the night Chloe came home, flashing a 3-carat diamond ring. She had managed to snag David, a junior investment banker from a family whose net worth was heavily documented in local magazines. The engagement wasn't just a celebration, it was a hostile takeover. Suddenly, the house became ground zero for a high-stakes theatrical production, and my existence was nothing more than an inconvenient prop blocking their stage. My own home felt hostile, but the true mechanical devastation had not even begun yet. Chloe's engagement mutated our living situation into a toxic, high-pressure pressure cooker. Helen and Tom became obsessed with projecting an image of generational wealth to David's family. They couldn't let his snobby parents know they were effectively squatters living off their son's charity. My grand, quiet house was suddenly overrun by wedding planners, florists, and caterers measuring the dining room for a rehearsal dinner. I was explicitly instructed by my mother to stay in my room or leave the house when David's parents visited. "Mark, please, just go to the movies tonight," Helen snapped one evening, swatting at my work boots. "The Vanderbilts are coming over for wine. If they see you in your dusty jeans, they'll think you're the hired help. We need everything to look absolutely immaculate for Chloe's sake." I was paying the electric bill for the chandeliers they were turning on to impress these people, yet I was treated like a stray dog begging for scraps. The disrespect was a physical weight, grinding against my patience like metal on metal. Chloe became an absolute monster, screaming at delivery drivers and throwing crystal glasses if the floral arrangements were slightly off color. When I asked her to keep the noise down because I had a 6 a.m. shift, she laughed in my face. "This is the most important day of my life, Mark. The world doesn't stop spinning just because you have a boring desk job." The financial demands started subtly. Helen cornered me in the kitchen, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Mark, honey, the wedding is getting a bit expensive. Since this is your only sister, we thought it would be a beautiful gesture if you chipped in for the catering. Only about $15,000. Think of it as an investment in our family's reputation." I stared at her, genuinely stunned by the audacity. I told her absolutely not. My grandfather's money was secured in a high-yield savings account, meant for my future, not a fleeting party. I walked away, locking my bedroom door, thinking that was the end of the conversation. I severely underestimated what my desperate family would do to maintain their pathetic, hollow illusion. The refusal to fund the wedding created a thick, suffocating silence in the house, but beneath that silence, a sinister machinery was turning. A few weeks later, I noticed the first glaring red flag. My mail stopped arriving. I usually received a thick stack of bank statements, utility bills, and junk mail every Tuesday. Suddenly, the antique brass mailbox at the end of the driveway was completely empty for days on end. When I asked Tom about it, he didn't even look up from his iPad, casually muttering that the postal service was probably just backed up. Then came the physical barriers. I came home from work early one afternoon to grab a file from my home office, a room on the first floor where I kept my grandfather's old oak desk and my private financial documents. The heavy brass doorknob wouldn't turn. It was locked. I never locked that door. When I finally found the spare key and forced my way in, the room felt wrong. The air was stale. My filing cabinet, which contained my birth certificate, social security card, and banking information, was slightly ajar. My stomach tightened. I confronted Helen immediately. She was polishing silver in the dining room, looking completely unbothered. "Oh, I was looking for a pen, Mark." "You are so paranoid," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You really need to stop being so dramatic. We have a wedding to plan, and your negative energy is ruining the aura of the house." I checked the cabinet. Everything seemed to be there, but the visceral feeling of violation crawled over my skin like a swarm of insects. I bought a heavy-duty deadbolt for my bedroom and office that very night, installing them myself while Tom glared at me from the hallway. "You don't trust your own flesh and blood?" he asked, his voice laced with venom. I didn't answer. I just drilled the screws deeper into the wood. The tension was a coiled spring, ready to snap at any second. I thought I had secured my perimeter, but the enemy was already deep inside my defenses. The ultimate insult came 3 weeks before the wedding day. I was sitting at the kitchen island, eating a cold sandwich, when Chloe marched in holding an embossed, gold foil seating chart. She slammed it onto the granite counter, looking at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Mark, David and I have made a decision. We aren't having you in the bridal party. You just don't fit the aesthetic we're going for. David's groomsmen are all partners at the firm, and you, well, you don't even own a custom suit. You'll be sitting at table 12 with the distant relatives." It wasn't just a snub, it was a calculated surgical strike to my dignity in the house I owned. I looked at her, realizing she viewed me not as a brother, but as a shameful secret. "Fine," I said, my voice dead and flat. "But table 12 better have access to the open bar." She sneered and walked away, completely missing the irony that she was acting like royalty in a castle she didn't own. I grabbed my keys and drove to the grocery store, needing to get out of that suffocating environment. I loaded up a basket with essentials and went to the checkout. The cashier swiped my debit card. "Declined." I frowned. Try it again, please. Sometimes the chip acts up. She inserted it again. The machine beeped an angry, mechanical red. Insufficient funds. A cold, heavy rock dropped in the pit of my stomach. That was my primary checking account, linked directly to the massive inheritance savings. There should have been over $12,000 in that checking account alone for daily expenses and property taxes. I pulled out a credit card to pay for the groceries, my hands trembling slightly as a terrifying puzzle began assembling itself in my mind. The locked office door, the missing mail, the sudden lack of complaints about my refusal to pay for the wedding. I sat in my car, staring at the declined receipt, as a sickening reality finally clicked. I didn't drive home. I drove straight to the main branch of my bank, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I walked into the sterile, heavily air-conditioned lobby and demanded to see a branch manager. A woman named Sarah ushered me into a glass-walled office, pulling up my accounts on her monitor. I sat across from her, the silence stretching tight as the clicking of her keyboard echoed in the small room. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mix of confusion and deep concern. "Mr. Evans, I'm looking at your primary savings and checking accounts. It appears there have been several massive wire transfers initiated over the last 45 days. To where?" I choked out, my throat suddenly dry as dust. She spun the monitor around. The screen was a digital slaughterhouse. Line after line of massive withdrawals, hemorrhaging my grandfather's hard-earned money. $18,500 wired to elite event planners, $12,000 to Lumiere Floral Design, $8,500 to a high-end bridal boutique in the city, $25,000 to a luxury catering company. The total devastation was staggering. Over $80,000 of my inherited cash, money meant for emergencies, future investments, and property maintenance, was completely gone, vaporized into silk, roses, and champagne. How is this possible? I demanded, my voice rising in panic. I didn't authorize a single one of these transfers. Sarah frowned, clicking through the authorization logs. "Sir, these transfers were initiated in-branch and via phone, fully verified with your social security number, your mother's maiden name, and exact account routing details. We also have 3 paper checks cleared, signed with your signature." She pulled up a scanned image of a check. I stared at it. The signature was a flawless, mechanical forgery of my handwriting. Helen. She had spent decades forging my dad's signature on loan documents. She had mastered mine while I was at work. The missing mail was her intercepting the fraud alerts. They hadn't just disrespected me. My family had systematically robbed me blind to fund a party. I left the bank with a thick manila folder full of printed statements, my vision swimming with a primal, blinding rage. I drove to a deserted parking lot and locked the doors, turning my car into a makeshift command center. I pulled out my phone and started making calls, suppressing my fury beneath a calm, professional tone. I dialed the catering company first, pretending to be David, the groom. "Hi, this is David checking on the final payment for the Evans wedding," I said smoothly. The coordinator on the other line was incredibly cheerful. "Oh yes. Helen came in last week and dropped off the final check for $25,000. She was so generous, saying her son Mark was thrilled to sponsor the entire feast." I hung up and called the bridal boutique. Same story. Helen had swiped a forged debit card, claiming I had explicitly authorized it as a wedding gift. She had used my stolen documents to bypass the bank's security protocols, meticulously draining the account in structured bursts to avoid triggering an automatic freeze. I spent 4 hours tracking every single dollar. $82,000 for $150. That was the exact price tag of their betrayal. They were sleeping under my roof, eating food from my fridge, and stealing my future to buy social status among strangers. The emotional impact was a visceral punch to the gut. I had loved them. Despite their flaws, I had wanted to protect them from the streets. But to Helen and Chloe, I was just an ATM, a resource to be mined and discarded. The sheer entitlement required to steal someone's inheritance and then exclude them from the event it paid for was sociopathic. I wasn't dealing with family anymore. I was dealing with parasites. I needed a weapon, and I needed to strike back flawlessly. I wiped the angry tears from my face, replacing my heartbreak with cold, calculated, mechanical vengeance. I thought the stolen cash was the absolute bottom of this abyss, but the deeper I dug, the darker the rot became. Late that night, I sneaked back into my own house like a burglar, bypassing the sleeping monsters upstairs. I locked myself in my office and booted up the desktop computer. I knew Tom used this PC for his business ventures, and I knew he was sloppy with his passwords. It took me 3 guesses to access his email account. I searched for keywords: Evans, bank, loan, collateral. A chain of emails from a predatory, high-interest private lending firm popped up on the screen. I clicked the PDF attachment, and my blood ran completely cold. It was a promissory note for $40,000, designated for a luxury Maldivian honeymoon package. But it wasn't a standard personal loan. Tom, the cowardly, silent accomplice who just drank scotch and avoided conflict, had secretly pledged the deed of my house as collateral. He had filed fraudulent paperwork, claiming power of attorney over my estate, using a notary stamp he likely bought online, to secure a massive cash loan against my property. If he defaulted, which he absolutely would, a lien would be placed on my grandfather's house. Tom hadn't just sat by while Helen stole my cash. He had actively mortgaged the roof over my head to pay for Chloe's vacation. The entire family was a synchronized crime syndicate, operating under the guise of wedding planning. I printed every single email, every fraudulent document, every digital footprint of their conspiracy. The printer whirred quietly in the dark, spitting out the exact ammunition I needed to destroy them. The betrayal was so absolute, so complete, that any lingering shred of familial love evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, unyielding resolve. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of wealth and status using my chips. I was going to flip the entire board and burn their pathetic fantasy to the ground. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove straight to the law offices of Mr. Vance. Vance was a silver-haired, razor-sharp attorney in his 60s who had handled my grandfather's estate for decades. He was a ruthless bulldog in a tailored suit, and when I laid the thick stack of bank statements, forged checks, and fraudulent loan documents on his mahogany desk, his eyes hardened into cold steel. "Mark," he said, his voice a low rumble, "this isn't just a civil dispute. This is grand larceny, wire fraud, and real estate fraud. Your mother and father are looking at serious federal prison time." "I don't care," I replied, my voice completely hollow. "I want the money back, I want the fraudulent lien destroyed, and I want them out of my house immediately." Vance didn't hesitate. He began drafting the paperwork with lethal efficiency. First, a comprehensive civil lawsuit against Helen, Tom, and Chloe for $82,000 plus damages. Second, a formal police report package to initiate criminal proceedings. But the most important document was the absolute 30-day notice to quit, a legally binding eviction notice that stripped them of any squatter's rights. "We serve them the eviction now," Vance instructed, stamping the documents. "By the time the 30 days are up, they will be legally required to vacate the premises, or the sheriff will physically drag them out. And based on this timeline, day 30 falls exactly 2 days before the wedding." I smiled, a dark, joyless expression. I drove back to the estate, slipping back into the role of the quiet, defeated brother. I walked past Helen, who was loudly barking orders at a florist in the hallway. I didn't flinch. I didn't scream. I just went to my room, locked the heavy deadbolt, and listened to them laugh, completely unaware of the massive legal guillotine hanging over their necks. I would let them build their beautiful, fragile glass castle right up until the final second. Maintaining my poker face over the next week was the hardest psychological endurance test of my life. Every time Chloe flaunted a new luxury item bought with my money, I had to physically bite my tongue to keep from screaming. But the closest I came to blowing the operation happened on a Tuesday night. I was in the kitchen pouring a glass of water when Helen cornered me. Her eyes were red, and she was putting on an Oscar-worthy performance of the stressed, overburdened matriarch. "Mark, honey, I know things have been tense," she sighed, placing a warm hand on my shoulder. The touch made my skin crawl. "We are just under so much pressure with the wedding. But we are family, and family protects each other, right?" She slid a stack of papers across the marble island. "Tom and I are sorting out our taxes, and since we live here, our accountant needs you to sign this simple affidavit acknowledging our residency and shared financial responsibilities. It's just a routine bureaucratic thing, sweetheart. Could you just sign the bottom line?" I looked down at the paper. It wasn't a tax document. It was a hastily drafted legal waiver, buried in dense jargon, attempting to retroactively classify the stolen funds as a gift and the fraudulent loan as a joint business venture. She knew I rarely read legal documents thoroughly. She was trying to legally immunize herself before I discovered the theft. The sheer manipulative evil of it was breathtaking. I looked up at her, suppressing the urge to throw the glass of water in her face. "I'm exhausted, Mom," I said, rubbing my eyes, playing the part of the tired, oblivious son perfectly. "I have a headache. Leave it on my desk. I'll read it and sign it this weekend when my brain is working." She frowned, annoyed by the delay, but nodded. "Don't forget, Mark. It's very important for the family." She walked away, completely unaware she just handed me the absolute final nail for her coffin. The timeline accelerated rapidly. It was exactly 32 days until the wedding, which meant the legal eviction clock needed to start ticking immediately. Helen had orchestrated a massive, lavish pre-wedding planning dinner at my house, inviting David and his incredibly wealthy, snobbish parents, the Vanderbilts. The dining room was transformed into a grotesque display of stolen luxury. Massive crystal centerpieces, a private chef searing Wagyu beef in my kitchen, and bottles of imported champagne chilling in silver buckets. I was explicitly told by Chloe to stay in my bedroom. "This is an intimate dinner for the core families, Mark," she had hissed that afternoon. "Just order a pizza and keep quiet. Do not embarrass me tonight." I agreed meekly, retreating upstairs. But I didn't order a pizza. I pulled my dark suit out of the closet, the one I wore to my grandfather's funeral. I dressed meticulously, straightening my tie in the mirror. I grabbed the 4 thick, heavy folders Mr. Vance had prepared. Inside each folder was a color-coded, heavily documented timeline of their massive financial crimes. Copies of the forged checks, bank wire logs, the fraudulent loan documents with Tom's IP address, and, right on top, the official, court-stamped 30-day notice to quit. Downstairs, the clinking of crystal glasses and the obnoxious laughter of high society echoed through the mahogany hallways. Helen was holding court, loudly bragging to David's mother about how the Evans family had spared absolutely no expense to ensure this wedding was the social event of the decade. I walked silently down the grand staircase, the thick carpet masking my footsteps. I stood in the shadow of the dining room archway, watching them gorge themselves on food paid for by my stolen future. I took a deep breath, stepped directly into the chandelier light, and smiled a cold smile. The dining room fell into an abrupt, dead silence as I stepped up to the head of the table. Helen's face went chalk white, the champagne glass freezing halfway to her lips. Chloe's eyes widened in sheer panic, recognizing the grim, unyielding expression on my face. "Mark," Tom hissed, half rising from his chair. "What the hell are you doing down here? Go back upstairs." "I'd like to propose a toast," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I didn't raise a glass. Instead, I tossed a heavy manila folder directly onto David's plate, then one to his father and one to his mother. The thick stacks of paper landed with a heavy, satisfying thud against the fine china. "To the beautiful bride and the incredible generosity of the Evans family." David's father, a severe-looking corporate lawyer, frowned and opened the folder. His eyes scanned the top document, the 30-day eviction notice. Then he flipped the page to the forged checks and the massive wire transfer logs from my inheritance account. "This dinner, the flowers, the dress, and the honeymoon you are about to take, David, were all funded by grand larceny," I stated loudly, making sure every syllable cut through the room like a razor. "My mother forged my signature to steal $82,000 from my grandfather's trust. My father fraudulently used my home as collateral for a high-interest loan. And Chloe knew about every single dime." "He's lying," Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking in pure desperation as she reached to snatch the folder from David. But David pulled it away, staring at the undeniable paper trail. His father was already reading the fraudulent loan document, his face twisting in absolute disgust. The mask of high society elegance shattered instantly, exposing the pathetic, criminal reality underneath. Their glorious, expensive fantasy was collapsing into dust right in front of their very own eyes. Complete and utter chaos erupted. Chloe launched herself out of her chair, screaming obscenities, trying to claw the documents out of her fiancé's hands. David physically pushed her away, staring at her as if she were an alien species. Helen, realizing that the undeniable proof was out in the open, immediately deployed her ultimate weapon. She collapsed onto the dining room floor, clutching her chest, dramatically gasping for air and weeping, screaming that her heart was failing. Nobody moved to help her. I just looked down at her, totally devoid of empathy. Save the performance, Helen. I already called the police before I walked downstairs to report the fraud. David's father stood up, his face a mask of furious contempt. He tossed the folder back onto the table. You people are absolute grifters, he spat, looking at Tom, who was silently weeping into his napkin. David, get your coat. We are leaving. David, please. Chloe wailed, grabbing his arm, her perfect blowout ruined as tears streamed down her face. It was just a misunderstanding. It's family money. It's stolen money, Chloe, David said coldly, shaking her off. The wedding is completely canceled. Do not ever contact me again. The Vanderbilts marched out the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind them with a booming finality. Chloe fell to her knees, screaming at me, throwing a heavy crystal wine glass that shattered against the wall near my head. I didn't even flinch. I calmly pointed to the eviction notice sitting on the table. You have exactly 30 days to pack your things. If you touch anything else in this house, I will have you arrested for vandalism tonight. Red squad car lights illuminated the driveway, finally signaling the absolute end of their toxic reign. The next 30 days were a living nightmare, but I held the line with brutal, mechanical precision. Helen and Tom tried every tactic in the book, sobbing apologies, religious guilt trips, and threats of suicide. I ignored them all. I communicated only through Mr. Vance. The police officially opened a criminal investigation into the wire fraud and the forged property loan, freezing what little assets my parents had left. When day 30 finally arrived, they were still refusing to leave, convinced I would miraculously cave at the final hour. I didn't. At exactly 8 a.m., 2 county sheriffs arrived with the execution order. I stood on the porch with a locksmith while the deputies physically escorted my weeping mother, a broken, silent Tom, and a venomous Chloe out the front door. They were allowed to take only their clothes and personal effects. Everything else belonged to the estate to cover the damages. You're a monster, Chloe screamed from the driveway, dragging a garbage bag full of designer shoes as the locksmith drilled out the old deadbolts. We're going to be homeless because of you. No, I replied smoothly, watching the brass lock tumble out of the door. You're homeless because you chose to steal my future to buy a party. Enjoy the streets. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, and the locksmith handed me the shiny new keys. The silence that fell over the house wasn't oppressive. It was heavy, clean, and beautifully absolute. I walked through the empty rooms, stripping the cheap modern art off the walls and throwing it directly into the dumpster. The machinery of their entitlement had been entirely dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing was left but the stark, cold reality of their actions. I poured a drink, sat at my grandfather's oak desk, and finally breathed in the peace. It has been 6 months since I legally eradicated my family from my life. The house is completely restored to the way my grandfather left it, quiet and secure. I sleep soundly every single night, unbroken by the grinding stress of their manipulation. The legal fallout was swift and devastating. Helen and Tom were formally indicted for wire fraud and grand larceny. They are currently living in a cramped, roach-infested weekly motel on the edge of the city, awaiting federal trial. The public defender assigned to their case told Mr. Vance they will likely serve real time. Chloe's life imploded spectacularly. Without David's money or my house to hide behind, her social circle completely abandoned her. She is currently working a minimum-wage retail job to pay for a tiny studio apartment, drowning in the massive credit card debt she accumulated trying to keep up her wealthy facade. They try to call me from blocked numbers occasionally, leaving sobbing voicemails begging for a second chance, begging for money, begging for mercy. I delete them without listening. The hardest lesson I learned through this visceral nightmare is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and generosity to toxic people is just self-sabotage. If someone views you as a resource rather than a human being, no amount of love, money, or shared history will ever fix them. You cannot negotiate with entitlement. You can only destroy it with absolute, uncompromising boundaries. I lost my parents and my sister, but I gained my dignity, my home, and my future. If you are setting yourself on fire to keep your family warm, stop immediately. Let them freeze in the dark while you safely and securely guard your hard-earned peace.